2 centuries ago, Napoleon Bonaparte actually issued this warning that history has, mostly just ignored until right now. He said, "Let China sleep, for when she wakes, she will shake the world."
Yeah, and well, if you're paying attention to the global stage today, you know the world is officially shaking.
It really
It's
is.
a seismic event. I mean, we are living through a realignment of power
Yeah.
that is entirely unprecedented in human history.
Right.
And that's both in its sheer scale and its velocity.
Right, and that is exactly our mission for today's deep dive. We are exploring the underlying structural reality of this huge global shift. We're looking closely at excerpts from Graham Allison's book, Destined for War.
Hmm.
And the goal here is to really figure out if the United States and China are, on an unavoidable collision course. We want to see what history actually tells us about what happens when a reigning global champion meets a rapidly rising challenger.
Yeah, it really is the defining question of our era, I think. Because, well, when you look at the historical data, the transition of power from one hegemon to another it's almost never a peaceful passing of the baton.
No, it's messy. And if you're listening right now thinking, well, I'm not a diplomat. Why should I care about some geopolitical theory?
Right.
Trust me, you need to care.
Absolutely.
This isn't just some abstract academic debate. We are talking about the underlying structural stress that dictates literally everything, from the price of your groceries to the architecture of the entire global economy to, frankly, the very real risk of a world-altering conflict in your lifetime.
Right, this impacts you directly. The foundations of the world order you've lived your entire life in, the economic supply chains, the security umbrellas, the technological standards, they're shifting right beneath your feet.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the core theory driving this entire dynamic. To understand the current tension between Washington and Beijing, we actually have to rewind the clock like 2,500 years, right?
We do, yeah. We have to go all the way back to ancient Greece.
Yeah.
We need to look at a mechanism that just perfectly maps onto our present moment. It's this concept known as Thucydides Trap.
Right.
So Thucydides, who chronicled the Peloponnesian War, he boiled the cause of that massive conflict between Athens and Sparta down to one incredible observation.
He wrote that it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable.
So it wasn't necessarily that, one side was evil and the other was good.
No, not at all.
It was just the sheer mechanics of a rising power running into an established one.
Exactly. And that is the trap. It occurs when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. When that happens, it causes massive structural stress in the international system.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Sparta was the dominant established power. They built the security architecture.
Right, they set the rules.
Yeah. And then Athens starts growing very rapidly. And as Athens gets bigger and wealthier, they naturally get more confident. They start demanding more respect and, more influence over how the whole region is run. Which makes total sense from the perspective of Athens. Like, you're bigger now. You want a bigger seat at the table. But if you're Sparta,
you view this as ungrateful and deeply, deeply threatening. You think, we provided the stable environment that allowed you to flourish in the first place, and now you want to upend all the rules.
wow, yeah.
So the ruling power reacts with insecurity and a determination to just defend the status quo. That friction, that natural, almost biological discombobulation, that is what creates the trap. It's not about malice, it's about structure.
Isn't this kind of like corporate disruption? I mean, think about when a startup like Uber disrupts a legacy industry like taxis.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
The established player panics. Right. They fight to keep their monopoly because the structure of their world is collapsing. But in international relations, the panic doesn't just mean a loss of market share.
No.
It involves nuclear weapons and military mobilization.
That is a brilliant analogy. The mechanical reaction is identical, but the stakes are existential. And to put some hard numbers on those stakes, if we look at the research out of the Thucydides Trap project at Harvard, they reviewed the historical record over the past 500 years.
Okay.
And they found 16 distinct cases where a major rising power rattled a dominant state, like Germany rattling Britain before World War I.
Right. So what were the results of those 16 cases?
Out of those 16 historical cases, 12 ended in war.
12.
12. Only 4 managed to avoid it.
12 out of 16. That is a profoundly uncomfortable ratio for the 21st century.
It really is.
But the research points out that the real danger in these scenarios isn't necessarily that the two leaders wake up one day and just consciously decide, hey, let's go to war, right? It's about how the trap creates an environment where things just spiral.
Precisely. The real danger is uncontrollable risks. When the structural tension is that high, otherwise manageable sparks like a border skirmish or a misunderstanding at sea, they can escalate with unforeseeable severity. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 is the ultimate case study of this mechanism in action.
Oh man, that is terrifying to look back at because JFK was actively trying to avoid stumbling into a global war.
He was. Kennedy was acutely aware of how leaders sleepwalked into World War I. He was actually reading The Guns of August at the time. He desperately wanted to avoid a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union. But because of the structural stress of the Cold War, he still felt compelled to make choices that drastically increased the risk of a Holocaust.
Like elevating the U.S. nuclear arsenal to DEFCON 2.
Exactly.
And for anyone who doesn't know, DEFCON 2 isn't just some scary alert level on a screen. It physically relaxes a ton of safety catches across the military.
Right. It decentralizes the ability to use nuclear weapons. Kennedy also issued public, time-limited ultimatums and drew unambiguous red lines. And by doing that, he essentially surrendered control of the situation.
Wow.
The fate of the world suddenly rested on events entirely outside his purview.
Like the incident with the Soviet submarine.
Yes.
That captain was exhausted, he was out of radio contact, and he was having depth charges dropped on him by the U.S. Navy. He literally thought World War III had already started and almost fired a nuclear-armed torpedo.
It was that close.
Or the American U-2 spy plane that accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace at the exact height of the crisis because the pilot got lost in the auroras. Like, you can't control that.
What's fascinating here is that Thucydides' use of the word inevitable was actually hyperbole. War isn't predetermined by some cosmic law, but the structural discombobulation is real.
Yeah.
When the system is primed for conflict, one wrong move by a stressed pilot or an isolated submarine captain and the system just takes over.
Okay, so if triggering the trap requires a rising power, we really need to look at China because the sheer velocity of their rise is what's causing this intense structural stress right now. But I want to understand the scale here because honestly, the numbers are almost hard to process.
The scale is something the human mind actually struggles to comprehend, especially from a Western perspective. Let's just look at the baseline. In 1980, China's gross domestic product was barely 7% of the United States.
Wow. 7%.
It was under $300 billion. 90% of Chinese citizens survived on less than $2 a day.
90%. And then you jump to 2015.
By 2015, their GDP hit $11 trillion, which is 61% of the U.S. at market exchange rates. And less than 3% of the population lives under $2 a day.
That's just
In a single generation, they went from a agrarian society to the manufacturing powerhouse of the entire globe.
But wait, I have to push back here for a second because the dominant narrative in the news lately is all about China's economic slowdown.
Right.
You constantly hear that their economy is faltering, that the massive growth era is over. So doesn't that take the pressure off the trap?
That is a very, very common misconception. The media loves the word slowdown, but we really have to ask slowing compared to whom?
Okay, fair point.
Yes, their growth has slowed from a historic 10% annually down to around 6 or 7%. But that slowdown rate is still 3 times higher than the U.S. recovery rate of 2.1%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Since the 2008 financial crisis, 40% of all global economic growth has been generated by one single country, China. Even at their current quote-unquote slower rate, they are literally creating an economy the size of Greece every 16 weeks.
Every 16 weeks? That's absurd. Which brings us to a crucial turning point. In 2014, the International Monetary Fund released a report using a metric called Purchasing Power Parity, or PPP, and this completely shifted the landscape, didn't it?
It did. It was a bombshell. According to the IMF measuring by PPP, China officially became the largest economy in the world in 2014.
Incredible.
$17.6 trillion compared to the U.S. at $17.4 trillion.
Can we pause there for a second? Because usually people measure GDP by simple market exchange rates, where the U.S. was still technically ahead. Why does purchasing power parity actually matter when we talk about geopolitical dominance?
It matters deeply, especially for military and infrastructure potential. PCP measures what a country can actually buy with its own currency inside its own borders.
Okay.
If China is building a stealth fighter or a nuclear submarine, they aren't paying their engineers or their steelworkers in U.S. dollars at the global exchange rate. They pay them in local currency. The materials are sourced locally.
Right, that makes sense.
So a dollar equivalent goes significantly further in China than it does in the U.S. When the CIA or the IMF wants to understand a nation's true geopolitical weight and military capacity, they look at PPP. And by that metric, the United States is already number 2.
And you really see that physical capacity in their infrastructure. I mean, there's a great example from the source material comparing Boston to Beijing.
Oh, the bridges, yeah.
Yeah, in Boston, there's this small bridge over the Charles River. It took 4 entire years to repair, and it snarled traffic the entire time. Meanwhile, in Beijing, they replaced the massive 1,300-ton Sinuan Bridge in exactly 43 hours.
It's almost impossible for the American mind to comprehend that pace.
43 hours.
The speed of development is just staggering. By 2005, China was building the square foot equivalent of today's Rome every 2 weeks.
Every 2 weeks.
They built a 57-story skyscraper in 19 days. Over the last decade, they've laid down 12,000 miles of high-speed rail.
How is that even structurally possible? If you look at California, they've been struggling to build a single 520-mile high-speed rail line, and that's not even supposed to be done until 2029.
It comes down to the mechanics of state capitalism versus a decentralized democracy. In the U.S., infrastructure projects face years of environmental reviews, local zoning laws, community pushback, and, endless budget battles in Congress.
Yeah, lots of red tape.
Exactly. In China, the central government has the authority to just mandate a project. They acquire the land, allocate the state-funded resources, and execute immediately. There is zero friction.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If you're the reigning global power, it's very easy to look at that and say, okay, they're great at pouring concrete and assembling smartphones, but that's just brawn. The United States still has the brains.
And for a long time, that was the prevailing attitude in Washington. But China recognized that imitation only gets you so far.
Right.
To truly secure their place globally, they had to transition from manufacturing to high-tech innovation. They are systematically building an intellectual foundation to challenge American supremacy in science and technology.
Let's talk about how they're doing that, because the educational numbers are wild.
China is currently producing about 1.3 million STEM graduates. That's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics every single year.
1.3 million. And the U.S.?
The United States produces roughly 300,000.
So they're outproducing us more than 4 to 1 in the exact fields that dictate the future of the global economy.
And it's not just volume. The quality of their institutions has rapidly caught up. U.S. News and World Report global rankings now place universities like Tsinghua ahead of MIT in terms of engineering programs.
Ahead of MIT, wow.
Yeah. They've aggressively funded long-term research in a way that just bypasses the short-term election cycles that often dictate U.S. funding.
I hear that, but I have to play the skeptic for a second. The common response in the West is, sure, they have a lot of engineers, but they don't actually invent anything. They just steal all our intellectual property. How much of this tech boom is just massive corporate espionage?
It's a very important question, and the research approaches it very objectively. Intellectual property theft is a documented reality of their development model. There's a famous assessment from former FBI Director James Comey stating that there are essentially 2 types of big U.S. corporations.
Okay, what are they?
Those that have been hacked by the Chinese and those that don't yet know they've been hacked.
Oh, man.
One analyst even cheekily referred to their early strategy as RD&T, research development and theft.
So the theft was a real accelerator.
It was undeniably a crucial part of catching up. But, and this is the critical distinction, you cannot steal your way into becoming the world's primary engine of scientific discovery.
Right?
You can steal a blueprint to build a jet engine, but you can't fake the fundamental path-breaking science required to lead the next century.
Right, because when you look at the patent filings, over 1 million a year, doubling the U.S. and what they are actually achieving today, you can't just fake that.
No, you can't.
They have the world's fastest supercomputer built entirely with domestic processors. They successfully launched the world's first hack-proof quantum communications satellite. They built the world's largest radio telescope. You don't get there just by copying someone else's homework.
Exactly. Their domestic innovation ecosystem is now completely self-sustaining. They have moved from being a fast follower to a frontier innovator.
So what does this all mean? We have a rising power with unprecedented economic scale, massive physical infrastructure, and a high-tech innovation engine. How are they deploying all of this to actually displace the United States globally?
They are using a strategy that targets the very architecture of American power. While they are rapidly modernizing their military using what we call disruptive innovation, like building cheap anti-satellite weapons to threaten multi-billion-dollar U.S. legacy systems.
It's like aircraft carriers and stuff.
Exactly. But their true weapon of choice isn't military. It's geoeconomics.
Geoeconomics, using economic leverage as a geopolitical weapon.
Yes. It traces back to the ancient Chinese strategist Sun Tzu. He said, ultimate excellence lies not in winning every battle, but in defeating the enemy without ever fighting. I mean, why risk a kinetic war when you can simply rewire the global economy so that resistance becomes mathematically impossible?
And the examples of this in action are incredibly surgical. It's not just blunt force, it's targeted economic pain. Tell the story about Japan and the rare earth metals.
Right, so in 2010, there was a maritime incident where Japan detained a Chinese fishing captain. Instead of escalating militarily, China quietly and abruptly stopped all exports of rare earth metals to Japan.
And rare earth metals are required for basically every modern electronic device.
Exactly. It instantly threatened to cripple Japan's entire high-tech manufacturing sector. Japan quickly caved and released the captain. China achieved a political objective through pure supply chain dominance.
Or look at Norway. The Nobel Peace Prize Committee, which is based in Norway, awarded the prize to a Chinese dissident. In response, Beijing didn't cut off diplomatic ties. They suddenly introduced strict inspections that effectively blocked all imports of Norwegian salmon.
Right.
They punished a key sector of the Norwegian economy over a political grievance.
And they did the exact same thing to the Philippines over a maritime dispute in the South China Sea. Suddenly, Philippine bananas were left to literally rot on the docks because they couldn't clear Chinese customs. It is asymmetric economic warfare through charm, largesse, bribes, and blackmail.
But they aren't just punishing countries, they are fundamentally disrupting the international institutions that the U.S. built after World War II to maintain the global order.
This is perhaps their most effective long-term strategy. Look at the World Bank. The U.S. has historically controlled it. When China's economy grew, they naturally wanted more voting power in these institutions. When the U.S. stalled on granting that influence, Beijing didn't just complain, they went out and built a rival institution called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or the AIIB.
And Washington went into full panic mode. They lobbied their allies incredibly hard, saying, do not join this bank. It's a tool for Chinese dominance.
And what happened? 57 nations signed up anyway, defying U.S. pressure, including major bedrock U.S. allies like the United Kingdom and Australia.
Because the economic gravity was just too strong to ignore.
Exactly. Add to that their One Belt, One Road initiative. We are talking about a $1.4 trillion infrastructure project designed to physically link 4.4 billion people across Eurasia with highways, rail lines, and deep-water ports, all funded and built by China.
Wow.
They are laying down the physical hardware of the 21st century global economy, and the roads all lead back to Beijing.
It reminds me of what Lee Kuan Yew, the former leader of Singapore, said about this dynamic. He pointed out that China is simply sucking the Southeast Asian countries into its economic system. It's not ideological, it's just mass and gravity.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it really helps to think of global power as a seesaw. In recent years, the United States has talked constantly about a pivot to Asia, shifting diplomatic and military weight away from the Middle East to counterbalance China in the Pacific.
Right.
But a seesaw only works if you have leverage.
And the U.S. is losing that leverage.
Exactly. The U.S. is trying to shift its weight, but China has spent the last 2 decades integrating itself so deeply into the trade networks and supply chains of every nation in the region that their side of the seesaw has grown incredibly heavy. America can pivot all at once, but right now its feet are basically dangling off the ground.
Which brings us back to the ultimate question of this deep dive. If the structural stress is this intense, are we destined for war? To synthesize what we've covered today, Thucydides Trap isn't a story of good guys and bad guys. It is about the incredibly volatile reality of a changing global hierarchy.
Yes, and it's fascinating how the research profiles the leadership navigating this volatility right now. You have 2 leaders, Xi Jinping in China and Donald Trump in the U.S., who operate with remarkably similar overarching ambitions.
And just to be completely clear for you listening, we are impartially reporting the sources comparison here. We're looking at their structural roles. We are not endorsing any political viewpoint.
Precisely. The analysis points out that both men utilize a form of populist nationalism. Both rose to power, promising to revitalize their nations and make them great again. And crucially, both view the other nation as the primary existential obstacle to achieving that historic destiny.
Which sounds like the absolute textbook recipe for triggering the trap.
It is a highly flammable combination. But we have to remember the vital, hopeful statistic we discussed earlier. Out of those 16 historical cases, 4 times war was avoided. The trap is not a death sentence.
But escaping it doesn't happen on autopilot.
No, not at all.
It requires radical adjustments. It demands sustained, top-level attention, massive cultural shifts, and a willingness from both sides to think the unthinkable and compromise in ways they never have before.
It requires an incredible amount of empathy and strategic restraint, often at the expense of domestic political popularity.
Which leaves us with one final provocative thought for you to mull over. We spend so much time in the West obsessing over the psychology of the rising power. We constantly ask, what does Beijing want? What are their intentions? But if we really want to understand how this plays out, we need to look inward at the psychology of the ruling power.
That is the hardest, most uncomfortable question a dominant nation can ask itself.
Right. If a catastrophic war is going to be avoided, how do you, as a citizen of a nation whose entire modern identity, whose economy, whose culture is completely intertwined with being, number one, fundamentally redesign your own worldview, to accept sharing the global stage as an equal? Because, as Napoleon warned, the giant has woken up, the global structure is shaking, and this new reality isn't going anywhere.